So our next speaker is Leif Bersweden, and he's the author of The Orchid Hunter and Winter Trees. Leif is a fellow of the Linnean Society, and he's currently doing a PhD in orchid genetics. So Leif wants to help us put nature back on the map. So let's give it up for Leif.
Hi everyone, my name's Leif. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think everyone can hear me. So my name's Leif. I'm a botanist, and I'm working down at Kew Gardens doing a PhD on wild orchid genetics. But I'm not here to bore you about the details of that this afternoon. I would like to talk to you about our wildflowers here in London and how we can all go out and look for them. So London is full of green spaces, as we have heard and will keep hearing, I'm sure, throughout the afternoon. And I want to spend the next sort of 10 minutes encouraging you to go out into these green spaces and, search for the wildflowers which grow right here in London. And I want to do this by using the London National Park City map, which is this amazing publication showing all the green spaces in London, from, the parks and woodland to cemeteries and sports fields, and even gardens are on there. So looking at this map is actually really encouraging, because you can see that London is just full of all these green spaces. So what I want to do is I'm going to take you on a little adventure through London for the next 10 minutes using this map. And I want to tell you about 3 of the coolest wildflowers that I found over the last 3 years while living in London. So, London is full of wildflowers, particularly the green spaces. Perhaps not as many as there could be, or perhaps should be, but there are wildflowers all over the place. We've got everything from daisies through to orchids growing all over London. So what I want to do is start right here in Holborn, where we are today. Right in the middle of London. You might think this is the last place in the world where you would want to look for wildflowers. But if you just, stop and take notice, you can find them even right here in the middle of London. So London's not so green spaces to start with. Even they hold wildflowers. So you'll notice, just walking around the streets, there are little plants growing in cracks in the walls. There are plants which are growing in between the paving slabs in the pavement. And I think it's really, really magical that these are plants which, they turn up every year, they sprout every year. We sort of walk past them every day, don't give them a second thought. But they are there, they all have names. They all have medicinal uses that people used to use a long time ago. They all have nutritional properties. They all have folklore associated with them. And I think it's really magical that these things exist. They're growing in very adverse conditions out of the pavement, but they're there and they come back year after year, despite our best efforts to get rid of them in many cases. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you across to sort of the Marble Arch up to Baker Street kind of area, and look at our first plant, which is this one called ivy-leaved toadflax. Now this is a slightly cartoonized image, so don't expect to see something quite so big and perhaps a little scary while you're walking down the street. But this is one of these plants which just grows in the pavement or in the cracks in the walls. Now ivy-leaved toadflax is it's a small plant. The leaves are sort of ivy leaf shaped, which gives it its name. And then it has these sort of snapdragon flowers, these sort of purple alien-like things with 2 big yellow eyes. And its name, Cymbellaria muralis, the Latin name. Muralis literally means of the city wall. So it's named after these places which it grows in. So it's very common in London. I've come up with a little rarity scale, and I've given it half a star on this scale. It grows in these cracks in the walls or in the pavement, and flowers generally between April and October. So it's got this long flowering window, but in reality, it will flower throughout the year. There will always be a few plants in flower. And it flowers almost everywhere. So wherever you go, keep an eye out in the walls and in the pavement, and you might just see this plant. So this is a very classic location for it. It's just sat on top of a wall, right next to the Thames. They're often found up at the top of walls, and they have this amazing way of getting around. So the ivy-leaf toadflax, when it does flower, because it's in a wall, it needs to get its flower out there so that insects can find it. And so when the flower is produced, it actually bends towards the light, away from the wall. This is my best ivy-leaf toadflax impression. It bends away from the wall towards the light, and the insects flying around will find it, and they will pollinate the flowers. But at the point where the flower has been pollinated and it's produced seeds, it then starts bending away from the light and back towards the wall, and will find the sort of dark crevices and cracks in the wall, which is where the seeds want to be. And so it deposits the seeds in those cracks, and then you get the new plants sprouting from those cracks. And what that means is you might see a plant one year at the bottom of a wall, and then you'll go back 5 years later and you'll find plants at the top of the wall because they sort of jump up through the cracks all the way to the top of the wall. So that's our first species. I'm going to jump back into the map now and take you down to Hammersmith, where a couple of years ago I found this weird looking plant here, which is called ivy broomrape. Now again, slightly larger than you'd expect it in real life. But ivy broomrape is an utterly bizarre plant. You can see it here growing just on Hammersmith roundabout, just by the side of the pavement in this sort of ivy-covered area. And they're sort of weird purpley brown spikes, which come up sort of, between 20 to 30 centimeters tall. And they have these sort of strange tubular flowers, which are really good for bees. Now, this one's slightly rarer. I've given it 3 out of 5 stars. And it will grow in any sort of ivy-covered ground, particularly under trees. It quite likes the shade. And it will flower June to July. Found across London. I found it on Hammersmith roundabout, and there's a lot in Hampstead Heath as well. But any sort of cemetery or areas where you've got large areas of ivy-covered ground, this thing will grow. Now, it's a very bizarre-looking plant. It kind of, I suppose, looks like a sort of rocket nose cone before it takes off. Perhaps you might think it looks slightly ugly in a certain way, but it is a completely bizarre plant. So the main thing you'll notice is that it's not green. And I think one of the first things we ever learn about plants is that they're green. The trees are green, the grass is green, all these leaves are green. Plants are green, except this one isn't. And this green comes from a molecule called chlorophyll in the plant, which the plant uses to take in the sunshine, turn it into sugars and carbohydrate, which it uses as food. So the ivy broomrape is not green, doesn't have any leaves, and so how on earth does it produce its own food? Well, it turns out it's a parasite. So this thing parasitizes ivy. So these seeds in the soil will germinate, and they'll put down little roots, and these roots sort of track down the nearest ivy plant, and it sort of grabs their roots, taps into them, and starts siphoning off everything it needs to survive. So it'll take water, it'll take the sugars and carbohydrates produced by the green leaves, it'll take all the nutrients that the ivy plant is taking out of the soil, and it will just sort of siphon these off in the correct quantity just to be able to keep it alive. And then when it's big enough, it will sort of produce these weird flowering spikes which come up in these patches of ivy. So it's a pretty cool plant. So to go back to the map, we're now going to go slightly northwest up to just north of Acton. There's a canal, the Grand Union Canal, which runs just to the north of Acton. And here we find bee orchids. Now, bee orchids are my favorite plant in the entire world. We have more than 50 species of wild orchid growing in the UK. and a good number of these will grow in London. I think I often get met with surprise that we have orchids growing naturally wild here in Britain, but yeah, we have more than 50 species, and the bee orchid is one of the most common to be found in London. So, it is much rarer in London, I'll give you that, but where it does grow, it is quite easy to find. It's very, very easy to go and find it if you know where it is. It likes growing on rough patches of grass, so we saw just alongside the canal here, in these sort of rough bits of grass. I found it at the London Wetlands Centre down near Barnes. So again, pretty near the centre of London, near Hammersmith. There are loads of them there down by the wetland. There are a few growing along the Grand Union Canal just north of Acton, and then Walthamstow Marshes just at the end of the Victoria line. Again, loads of bee orchids there, particularly as you work further north up into the Lee Valley Park. There are absolutely loads of them in sort of May, June time. Now, the bee orchid has an incredible pollination mechanism, which I am very excited to tell you about. So they basically exploit the sexual desire of male bees. So male bees and female bees emerge at different points in the spring. There's often this sort of 2-week lag between the two emerging. So male bees hatch first, and then there's a period of time before the females emerge. Now, the orchids, both the bee orchid and its close relatives, have evolved to time their flowering period to coincide with this period of time when there are male bees flying around, but no females. And to a male bee, the flower of the bee orchid looks, smells, and feels exactly like a virgin female bee, which is extraordinary in itself. So, we have a male bee, he's just hatched and he's flying around and he has one job, and that's to find a female to mate with and pass his genes on to the next generation. So he's flying around, searching for a female to mate with, and he comes across a population of bee orchids, and he thinks he sees a female resting on the flower with her head buried amongst the petals. And he thinks, great, this is my lucky day, I've scored. And so he flies down, he lands on the flower, and still completely convinced that this is a female bee, attempts to mate with the flower. Now, while this is going on, the bee orchid sort of carefully drops pollen onto the back of the bee's neck in 2 little sort of sacs. And the bee, completely oblivious of this, has no idea what's going on. But after a while, the bee orchid obviously isn't really doing anything, and the bee starts to get slightly frustrated by the lack of action, and so buzzes off in search of a more enthusiastic partner. And so our male bee again is flying around. He's looking for a female to mate with. There still aren't any around. And he comes across a new population of bee orchids, immediately falls for the ruse all over again. And in attempting to mate with this next flower, then deposits the pollen on his neck onto the female reproductive surface on the flower and pollinates the orchid. So it's this absolutely amazing, incredibly ingenious system. And this entire fraud is masterminded by a plant, which is great. I always love it when the animals get one over on the plants get one over on the animals, because it always seems to be the other way around. So the bee orchid has actually abandoned this system. Its close relatives still do this. The bee orchid, though, has the insect, the bee species which pollinated it, has either died out or moved on to a different orchid. And so the bee orchid has had to make this drastic lifestyle change, and has now sort of pollinates itself rather than doing this incredible mechanism. But it's certainly evolved this way of getting pollinated. So I just want to finish by encouraging you to go out into London's green spaces and not so green spaces to try and find these wildflowers which grow, in our city, and it's such a therapeutic activity, looking for plants. It's really good for the soul. And yeah, I thoroughly recommend, even if, if you're in Walthamstow Marshes or out in the streets here around Holborn, just keeping an eye out for wildflowers. It's such a good way of engaging with nature, and particularly getting children to engage with nature. So they are my 3 favourite wildflowers in London. And go out and see what you can find. Thank you very much.